Hello and welcome, Exile, to another Leaguestart test, this time with Cold Dot. Archetype I haven't really done much of, and quite frankly, I think most people wrote off as dead when they killed Vortex's instant cast ability. In other words, I was testing something that I thought might be fun, maybe it could be good. A lot of people wrote it off, and what did I come away with as a conclusion? Number one, it deals actually a surprising amount of damage for a dot build this early on. Number two, it does require a lot of buttons, but I thought it was still, I don't know, I still enjoyed playing it. There's something satisfying about having a character's or enemy's HP just drain down rapidly. There's a sweet satisfaction when you're playing a dot build that type of damage being dealt. It's a little bit different feeling to having the enemy just getting chunked in one hit or whatever, but there's something satisfying about it. And number three is it's surprisingly good. I actually was able to do, of the characters I've been testing, I've been going through the same test, which is, can it do an early Sanctum in a very short amount of time? Now, total hours spent when I was making this character, progressing it, I finished my Sanctum at about 5 hours and 11 minutes of actual playtime. This was involving leveling to level 70. Eventually, throughout the course of the Sanctum, I went from level 70 to 72 in my first Sanctum. You get quite a bit of XP progression when you do Sanctum. It's not too bad in terms of XP. But number one was, I leveled to 70. I did a little bit of heist to get roughly the amount of currency I believe the items I'm using were expected to be. And then I just ran the Sanctum and just see how it could do. And as you saw in the first clip there, it was clearly enough damage to kill guards and to be somewhat mobile, while having the one downside being there's quite a bit of casting. For example, we want to put 2 brands on our enemies because we have Runebinder with Wintertide Brand. This is a skill that ramps up in dot damage over time. You want a decent amount of cast speed and some duration to really make this skill start to deal some decent damage. We also have Creeping Frost, so we can put this down as our secondary dot skill. The one thing you're doing when you're playing a dot build is trying to fit in as many damage skills as you can with 3 or 4 or 5 links, just so you can have a bunch of dot damage all on the enemy. The more you can do, the more you can layer your damage. Cold Dot, of course, used to be one where you could do Vortex, Cold Snap, Creeping Frost. You could layer like 3 or 4 of them, but having Vortex no longer be an instant cast kind of makes it a bit too hard in terms of casting to get all those up, unless you're a real god gamer, of course. And then I also have Frostbomb and Frostbite, my curse, just to lower enemies' res. You'll say when I go up to an enemy, I'll cast some Wintertide Brands to get them to start ramping. I'll cast my Creeping Frost, and I'll do Frostbomb, Frostbite. That's a lot of buttons, but it does a decent amount of damage. And so if you're okay with the buttons, it works out pretty well. Now, my approach to this, and you're going to notice a common theme, and you're going to say, Lance, you're a one-trick pony, but I can defend myself, okay? Number one, why do I like doing the dual hand, wield, leveling? In E-Blade setups and stuff, I end up respecking this out because you eventually want a shield or you want to do two-hand. But as far as a self-caster goes, the big reason for this dual wield setup is specifically I want to move fast. Dual wield gives you an attack speed bonus, I believe, of about 10%. It also gives you the ability to grab this cluster here, which is a bunch of cast speed and has a really good 60% damage mastery. And the reasoning here is while we're leveling, we just have good leap slam time. This is a game changer through going through the axe quickly. Really, for myself, when I did leveling, I used to be consistently around the 6-hour mark just to beat the campaign, not do any extra farming and get chaos and heist, just beating the campaign. It was something that would take me 5+ hours to 6 hours, and ever since I've been doing some practice with the dual wield ascendancy, I've been getting much closer to that 4-hour to 5-hour range in terms of farming up some currency and heist and doing basically all the passive tree missions. And I have to say, I'm sold on it. It's a little bit more of you have to mentally engage yourself to it, but if you try it out, you might find you like it. But my point is I go into this for attack speed, I go into Spiritual Command for attack speed, and I go into Redemption up this side for attack speed. It's all just to make our Leap Slam a bit faster to keep us highly mobile, because you'll see our boots are terrible. They don't have movement speed, they have bad res, they have bad life. You're not guaranteed to get some good movement speed boots, and you're not guaranteed to get them with the stats you want. So a lot of times this is a way to negate having bad RNG of bad movement speed boots and still be pretty fast, because when you're leap slamming around, you don't care as much that you don't have movement speed on your boots. Outside of that, you'll notice I have some uniques on this character, and a lot of people don't like that I do this, but I always plan my league starters around the league start economy and around being in a trade league. And there's things I understand and know about trade that is just going to be consistent. Number one is Ghostwrite. This chess piece, it's a T4. That means it's pretty dang common. And number two is it's a low level unique, which means every single player has a chance to drop this in Act 1. This is going to be way more abundant on the market than a T5, a even more common item that doesn't drop until their level people are level 60, right? Because if there's a drop restriction, the fact that you've had thousands, hundreds of thousands of people all have the chance to be running content to drop this means there are going to be a lot that have been generated on the market. There's a reason why certain items that are drop restricted to, elder bosses that are late game bosses, even though they might be a common drop early league, they're rare because very few people have gotten to the content yet. Now, the idea is I'm targeting A, low level uniques, and B, uniques that have a very high chance to drop in terms of they are very common uniques. Ghostwrite is a good example. This chest I've fallen in love with, not only for stacking ES high, but a new setup which I am going to be commonly forcing into spell builds. It's a setup where we're forcing in more damage via this, and I feel like I can get away with in terms of rushing Sanctum. This isn't something I'd recommend going into generic mapping, generally just something I like as a tech to force more damage early to push Sanctum early. And the reason I like it is I feel like I can click Pain Attunement and reserve some of my life, not wasting any reservation space on Petrified Blood, right? We're making our HP pool really small, right? But the upside is, number one, we have good chaos res on this chess piece. So between this chess piece, Alori's Lantern, and a little bit of chaos res we get over here, and if we don't kill Katava, we're at 50-something chaos res. If you put one more item of chaos res, you can be chaos res capped, which is going to make you similarly tanky to a 3k life character, 4k life, or a 2.5k life character that has 0 chaos res, which is most characters that are just pushing into maps, and generally it is tanky enough to do these early sanctums because there's not a lot of chaos damage. It's mostly just Lycia. And number two is it allows us to click Pain Attunement without clicking Petrified Blood while also running quite a few damage auras. Now, I ended up opting for Determination. I decided I'd rather have a little bit of armor just so I'm not getting stunned all the time, because if you have absolutely no armor, you're just going to be getting stunned a lot. And so I did that as a pseudo compromise. We could have gone, for example, with Calm's Roots to do the stun immunity, which is an item I love to use with this chess piece, obviously. But I opted to just try a setup without Calm's Root, and my impression was it worked pretty well. Ultimately, we could have probably dropped Determination, picked up Zealotry for another damage aura, and done a little bit more damage. But I just, tried to hybridize it a little bit here just to test out some different things. Granted, I don't really have much armor scaling, so is it really that much of a commitment? Maybe I should have gone into things like Sanctity, things like Faith and Steel, but that's neither here nor there. The point I'm trying to make is essentially early league Ghostwrite allows you to reserve some of that life when you're going into a Sanctum and still be relatively tanky enough where you're not going to randomly just die. I did fight, I believe on this run, I even fought the Chaos boss. Or I've done the Chaos boss on multiple different runs when I've been doing this, and I haven't died to the Chaos damage, even though I have a very smaller HP pool because of Ghostwrite, but I also get Chaos Res, which kind of negates some of that downside. Now, outside of that, we chose Darkseer and Redbeak because I was planning to go low life. This is a very fast attack speed sword. It gives 100% damage when you're on low life. It's not the best damage item, but I just chose it because it keeps my leap slam speed relatively fast, and it does have some damage, and it also triggers the condition for us to be wielding 2 different weapon types, thus getting this mastery for 60% damage, and it works out pretty well. Ultimately, these are items you want to be swapping out of. It's just kind of an early game, get some percent damage. Same thing with Darkseer here. Give some mana, give some life, and then give some percent damage. It just works out decently. But ultimately, it's not necessary. Eventually, you're going to swap out of the dual wield. Eventually, you're going to go to a shield. You're going to upgrade other things. You're going to push gem levels. But this is just something that I like as an early game combo to keep that leap slam speed and to still have decent damage. Outside of that, one of my other favorite go-to items is Khaleesi's Grace. If you're a self-cast build, this is always a nice early 5-link, very common item. And I think this might be a level 60 item. I'm not sure. I can't remember. It's a level 55. So it's not super high level, but it's a little high level. I don't know what the drop restriction of this one is, but for the most part, it is very common on the market, usually about 1C on Leaguestart. Fantastic early item. Same with Lori's, very common low level item. Great for if you're going low life, gives enemies unlucky damage while hitting you, which makes you a bit more tanky, along with having some nice little res, give you some movement speed. I just like this item early. Again, all these uniques that I'm using in this build, they're not mandatory. They are just things that are strong enough to give you something to target as, okay, these pieces, plus a little bit of rares to fill in the res and get a little bit of life, is going to get me strong enough to beat that threshold of Sanctum. And that's the whole point. There's a reason I did Heist during this run. I wanted to farm 10 plus C, and then I would tell myself, okay, this is enough currency to do my sockets, and this is enough currency to buy these items. For example, I made sure I had enough jewelers to 4-socket my items, and then 4-link them, and then color them for my necessary 4-links. Ryan Gaze, the last and final piece here. This is the one piece I would have a little bit of caveat, a little bit of concern of, would this item exist early league? Number one is, I think it is fairly common. I checked the PoE Ninja chart. It was 1C the entire league, but at the same time, it's for Cold Dot. Cold Dot last league just got nerfed and Vortex getting taken away. I believe most people said, I'm going to play something else. If Vortex is gone, I'm gone. And I think it's one of those things where if Cold Dot is popular, this could see a price spike and be a bit more expensive on Leaguestart. Not too sure which way it would flow, but ultimately, this is a large amount of damage. I would say, if you're looking at starting Leaguestart, just try to feel out how popular, how many people are recommending Cold Dot. I don't think many people will. It's still relatively fresh in the memory that Vortex got killed, and I think people won't play it. So this is one of those things where if you're looking for something that's strong, that not a lot of other people are playing, you don't want competition on your items, I think Cold Dot could do it. And I liked playing with his thing. It's 50 Cold Dot multi and allows you to have Conk Effect on your Creeping Frost, which means you have a decent amount of damage. I did this with a level 17 Creeping Frost and a level 18, I believe, Wintertide. Ultimately, pretty low on the damage end. Creeping Frost all the way up to level 20 gets another like 800 base damage, which is like 60-70% more damage than what we have now with just a couple levels. And then same thing with the Wintertide. It goes from 220 at its base to 260, and that's a stacking multiplier you get on it that gets pretty decently on top of having 2 of them per enemy. So it works out pretty well, I'd say. Ultimately, I didn't know what to expect going into this, but I feel like from playing it, Cold Dot's pretty strong. It just requires a decent amount of buttons. Probably not going to be super popular. And if you're looking for something that I believe is strong, but you don't want to have competition on your late game items, Cold Dot is a decent option. Because ultimately, if it's not a popular build and not a lot of people are playing it, a lot of your late game Giga upgrades are going to be cheap. Things like maybe Cold Dot. A Fractured Cold Dot mod is probably going to be a lot cheaper than, per se, a Fractured Chaos Dot if Poison is popular, or a Fractured Fire Dot if Righteous Fire is popular, etc., or Ignite's popular. You get the idea. The point I'm trying to make is there's value in playing a build that isn't popular, especially when it's a build that isn't popular and is strong. There's very few builds I have played that meet the threshold of beating a Sanctum first try when you're just level 70 and you've just been bum rushing the campaign, you made a few Chaos, and you're just going into it. And Cold Dot met that threshold. As for why am I doing Hierophant versus Occultist versus Elementalist versus Trickster, all those sorts of ascendancies have their pros and cons. Personally, I chose Hierophant for a few reasons. Number one is Arcane Blessing is one of the best nodes in terms of giving you a lot of damage multiplier. This thing gets affected by all your Arcane Surge effects. So 20% here, we get 20% here, we get 20% here, we get up to 50% here. Ultimately, you end up getting this to be almost 40% more damage from this one node, which is great for that node. That's probably the biggest node we pick. And then on top of that, I really like these nodes here as well. Now, these are strong subtly, I think, or subtly. I don't freaking know what I'm saying. Point is, when you grab this wheel here, it does a couple things. Number one is it fixes your mana, a problem where normally you'd have to invest into stuff on your tree and be like, how do I solve my mana? How do I deal with this? This wheel on itself fixes mana, because on all this stuff, you're getting mana regen, you're getting percent mana, and then on top of that, you're getting this 50% less mana cost right out the gate. Now, this would allow you to, one, potentially be able to work in a blessing, if you will, on the lower portion of your mana pool, depending on how you work out your reservation. Number two, it gives you reservation efficiency, so I was able to reserve 3 50% reservations, so I was tempted to do Zealotry for triple damage auras, which most builds don't have that opportunity. Like with only one aura wheel and the fact we're getting damage from these nodes here and I get to click mana reservation while picking up damage feels pretty good. Not many builds get to do that. Normally they have a more larger opportunity cost of, one, they have to invest in those mana nodes just to get the reservation efficiency, and they have to be grabbing this cluster over here and they still don't have enough reservation efficiency. but this build just does it without an align, and it feels pretty good. On top of that, number 2 is it makes this a decent amount more tanky in terms of this early game push. This node right here gives a fair amount of ES. You'll see we're at 3,600. If I take away this node here, we go to 3,100. Pretty sizable 500 ES jump. It's the difference in making sure we're above that threshold of being a squishy, frail thing that's going to die in one hit to being just above the one hit threshold in most scenarios. And in Sanctum, for the most part, there's very few things that can kill you in one shot, especially the early game Sanctum. There's a reason I emphasize pushing damage if you're trying to push Sanctum early for making money, because the damage you need, or the defenses you need, is quite a bit lower in these cases. For the most part, when I did my Sanctum run, I only went to half ES once, taking I think multiple sizable hits at the same time, because ultimately in Sanctum they just don't deal a lot of damage, but you have to be careful for things like the Lycia waves. You need to know how to do that wave phase. I'd definitely practice it if you want to do a Sanctum rush. And number 2, you need to be careful of some of the chaos mechanics. There's the Reliquary boss on the floor 2 of Sanctum. You need to be wary of that if you're going for this sort of approach. But ultimately, this is the setup I went for. I'll give you guys a little showcase of another quick little room here. I'll go for these Chaos Orbs, but just to give you an idea of what it looks like killing guards and stuff, we pretty much just jump around, put on Wintertide brands, cast a Creeping Frost, Frostbomb, Frostbite, all this stuff to give multipliers, and then just try to stay mobile is pretty much how the build ends up shaking out. So you'll see I would do, like, by the time I've cast all the curses and stuff, they're almost already dead. Like, for example, if I don't remember to do a Frostbomb or a Frostbite, but I have these Wintertide brands on here, there's still the scenario where the enemies can die if I'm, like, trying to cast on another enemy, or I'm trying to worry about something else. Like, I can go over here, they're taking damage, right, and they're still dying. I think my Wintertide brand wore off of that guy right before he died, and I jumped into a fireball, which is a little bit of a fail. But hopefully that gives you an idea of, you can kind of cast these things, they'll start dotting the enemies, and you can move around. One of the important things about Sanctum is, number 1, it's damage, which this does decently, but number 2, it's the ability to be on the other side of the screen, hiding behind a wall, or just staying away. Because if you have to be point blank, there's a lot of trap rooms, like the laser rooms, where if a guard is, per se, camping against a wall, and he's next to one of those laser turrets, it's very hard to do damage, and that's part of the reason why melee has a bit of a harder time in Sanctum, is because if you need to be that close, it's much harder to do damage and not take resolve loss. All Sanctum is about is, 1, trying to take as little resolve loss as possible per each room, and having some ability to be ranged, dealing high damage. All those things contribute to avoiding that. And number 2, it's about some level of mobility, speed, staying away from that stuff, obviously. Anyways, this is Cold Dot Hiero. I wanted to test it out. Pleasantly surprised, does a lot of damage. I'll have the POB for those curious that want to try it out. I would say this has probably got a good shot at being a really strong character, especially considering I don't think it's going to be popular. I'm not going to make a build guide on it myself. I'm not going to promote it outside of this video of just showcasing it. But it's up to you. It's got a lot of buttons. Not a lot of people are necessarily about that life, but I think it's pretty dang strong for the gear level. I don't know how much it's going to plateau, but my guess is, when you're talking about making upgrades and you have the ability to buy Fractured Cold Dot, and there's a lot less people competing for those items, I think you can make a pretty strong character on a lot lower budget than you could with another archetype like Ignite, where Fire Dot multi is going to be a lot more competitive in terms of, like, people trying to buy it. I don't know where I'm going with this. Point is, I like Cold Dot Hiero. This is the setup I used. I can definitely say it's quite strong. Thank you, Brian, for yourself. Hopefully these videos are helping you guys give an idea for something you might want to League start. As always, thanks for watching, Exiles. Take care. Peace out.